All righty. Good evening, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Okay. It says on.
Yeah, it's not. It doesn't.
Yeah. It's on. There you go.
Ah, there we go.
Maybe this works. Huh? Hello, hello, hello.
I know I can talk loud.
No, they can't hear you online.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
Hello, hello, hello. Hello. There we go. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming today. It's been, I think, a 14th-month hiatus here, so we certainly appreciate you coming. Before Nikki jumps on here, we're just going to talk about if there's bottled water back there, and bathrooms are just around the corner here. If you have any questions, please let us know. I'll hand it off to...
Hi, I'm Nikki Liebman, and nice to see you all again. We appreciate everybody keeping their distance. Thank you very much. And we also would appreciate if you keep your mask on, unless you're drinking water, of course. It is my pleasure to welcome everybody back, but in particular, Dr. Rob Abbott, who is going to kind of go over the agenda for the night.
Thank you for that smattering of applause. That's much appreciated. So sincerely, welcome back to this process. This is very important to the School District of Fort Atkinson over not just the next year or two, but potentially the next couple of decades. And while we may not have great in-person attendance, I just want to remind everyone here that we are recording and streaming this event so that other members who are unable to join us in person this evening will be able to get the same information and provide the same feedback that we'll be soliciting from you at the end of the meeting. So one of the things I'd like to do is just step back a little bit. And this evening's meeting is very intentionally planned. And we're not forging ahead with where we left off in February of last year when we sat over at Purdy. And we were getting close to doing some decision making. And we were getting close to wrapping up our work together as a facilities advisory committee. And yes, the charge of this group is, in fact, to provide options to the board for the board to consider. And we're hoping that that would be able to happen in August if we can do some work together over the next 3 months. The board's job then is to charge the administration and to charge our communications team to really flesh out what those options are, to see what the viability is, to see where we could get traction in the community, to see what options are embedded within the options that the FAC may take a look at. So when we talk about facilities, there are a lot of things that have changed over the last 14 months, and there are also a lot of things that have not changed. And when we talk about education, there's a lot of things that have changed and remained unchanged. Or even on the financial side, we're in the same situation. Things that have changed and things that have remained unchanged. And that's our effort this evening, is just to sort of grease the wheels and get people's head back into what is the current situation that we're in. What is it that we view our future situation to be, and how is it that the Facilities Advisory can provide options to the board that will address our physical needs, our social, emotional, educational needs of our students, not just, like I said, over the next year or two, but 10 years, 20 years or more into the future. So with that, I'm very happy to turn things over to Mr. Demerath, our Director of Financial Services, and he'll be able to start working us through our agenda this evening. Jason.
All right, let's see. Okay. I'll just quickly go through. You have the agenda on your seat there. But we're going to start, like Dr. Abbott said, talking about what has changed and what hasn't changed and kind of get everybody regrounded in the options that remain on the table here tonight. And I'm going to start with what has changed. And the first item to talk about is what's changed on the maintenance end of things. So over the last year, 14 months, on the maintenance side of things, obviously our space limitations have been amplified. We were unable to return all of our secondary students immediately in January because of distancing and lack of flexible spaces in those 2 buildings, and that ended up creating close contacts with too many kids. But the overall flexibility of space was amplified over the last year. We did evaluate our HVAC systems for filtering and made adjustments there as possible for airflow. And again, our buildings are now a year older, 14 months older than the last time we met. And as things get older, things continue to fail and new issues arise, and that's what's happened in the last year. However, over this time, we've continued to work on managing our issues, and one example of this is high school energy and maintenance projects that were actually approved to move forward by the board at last Thursday's board meeting, and that's the main topic that I'm going to bring this group up to speed on tonight. So the energy and maintenance projects that were approved by the board last week, our goal in looking at those projects was to replace and upgrade the failing mechanicals in the high school without a referendum and by utilizing energy savings in our regular operational budget. Our building at the high school, our new school, is now 22 years old, and as any homeowner knows, when you hit that 15 to 20 year mark, things start failing and furnaces and all that other stuff starts going. And so everything up there is getting past its useful life. But we looked at the high school and the high school only because that was the only building in the options that remain with this group that doesn't call for major renovations or replacement under any of those 3 remaining options. And so that's why we targeted kind of the guts of that building to make it last into the future. The thing I'll note, though, is that athletic fields and academic programming facilities needs up there are not taken care of. It truly is just mechanicals and the guts of the building that we're looking at with this project. And so there's 2 sides of this. The first side is energy savings projects, and these are the projects up there that will save energy money that will help offset the costs of all the projects that are both on this energy savings list and a maintenance list that I'll review in a minute. We're looking at an LED lighting retrofit up there, building envelope improvements, destratification fans in the high ceiling areas to push down the warm air, a complete replacement of the pool pump motor and filters, a boiler replacement up there, and then replacing all of the HVAC, the heating, ventilating, air conditioning controls, and replacing some HVAC equipment up there. And the estimated annual energy savings for these projects is just under $100,000, and then there's some one-time focus on energy rebates available for these as well. So the savings from these projects also help to offset other maintenance projects that aren't energy savings, but we know we have to take care of. Just to highlight a few here, replacing the chiller and tower there, which is undersized currently on a warm day by early afternoon, we end up running out of cool air, and it's pretty warm by the end of the day up there. Replacing some hot water heaters up there, replacing faucets throughout the building other than in science rooms, replacing the clock system, which constantly malfunctions, and then covering all of the urgent items on the facility study list that C.G. Schmidt and PRA put together. The annual estimated maintenance savings for this is just under $130,000. One thing to note there is that's not actual budget savings. That is money and time of our maintenance staff that can be reallocated then to other issues within the district. So overall, you can see here that all of these projects together would cost roughly $3.2 million, and you can see the energy savings and maintenance savings there with a simple payback of just under 14 years. But if you look at the bottom there, that's the snapshot from the facility study list. We end up knocking off about $3.2 to $3.4 million in projects, and what remains at the high school from this study are mainly replacements of the full roof, parking lots, and the addition of a fire suppression system. Other than that, it's a lot of smaller projects that are left on the list here. So overall, like I said, 3.2 million total cost, 4 million with interest, but 2 million of that is taken care of through energy savings over the next 20 years. And then the district budget kicks in $100,000 per year for the next 20 years. And those, the costs and the energy savings are both conservatively calculated, so those could end up being better than estimated here. And then again, we free up about $130,000 in maintenance time and money. But we end up with completely upgraded systems, controls, and the capacity in those systems to meet demands of that building as it currently functions. Next, I'm going to talk about what's changed financially for the district since we last met. So we met last February, and in April we had an operational referendum that passed last April. That was a 3-year referendum, and I'll talk a little bit about the impact of that next. Also, I'm sure as everybody is aware of, the federal government's been releasing COVID relief funds, and I'll talk a little bit about that tonight as well, how much we're getting and possible plans for those. And then also approved at last week's board meeting, the board approved to prepay some debt, and I'll talk about how much was prepaid and how that impacts this process. There are some major unknowns, though, as we sit here tonight on the financial side of things. One being enrollment, which Dr. Abbott will talk about later, the pending state budget, and then what will actually happen with property values and how that might impact taxes in the future. But all of these three big things impact district revenue and possible tax impacts of any referenda in the future. So this is the financial forecast as it stands as of last week. You can see that during the 3-year period of the current referendum, we essentially break even, and then the $3 million operational referendum falls off, and we would have to go back for a referendum in the 23-24 school year. On the tax rate side, you can see we hover around $11, which is pretty much where it's been for quite a while, right around $11. And but then again, that operational referendum expires. The tax rate at that point would drop, both between the expiration of the operational referendum and the expiration of some debt, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But that basically creates the gap or the place where any future referendum could fill in to get that tax rate back up to that $11 range that it's been hovering for quite some time. COVID relief funds. So there were 3 rounds that the district is going to receive. The first one was last summer. That was about $250,000. And that was all used basically to reopen in the fall, last fall, spent on software and technology and mitigation practices and plexiglass and all disinfecting products and all of that stuff and PPE. So all of that was used last summer and into the fall to reopen. The next round that was approved in December ranges from about $900,000 to $1.2 million for the district, and that amount is yet to be fully known, and we won't fully know that amount until the fall. But that money can be used for pretty much anything, and as of right now, about all we've determined is that there were some Chromebooks that we need for next school year that we'll be purchasing. And then the third round that was just approved in March, that is looking like it's going to be about $2.15 million, but we don't have all the details on that. We don't have the total amount, but within that, again, eligible expenses are pretty much anything except we have to set aside 20% of that to target learning loss. And within that learning loss set aside, we're looking at elementary math interventionists and coaches for 3 years. That was approved by the board last week. Overall, we'll be discussing and wrestling with decisions around this money with the administrative team and the board, and the best way to invest these funds to benefit our students over the next 3-4 years as these funds are available. So that's the next process after we find out exactly how much and what the limitations are on it. And then finally, I had mentioned that we prepaid some debt. This chart shows what happened with our debt history. So back in the early 2000s, we passed the geothermal referendum, and that the blue bars that you see there were the original debt that was scheduled to expire this year, actually. It was scheduled to be paid off. But going into the 2016 referendum, the board decided to refinance that and extend it out to 26-27 and make the payments annually less so that the operational referendum in 2016 would fit within the current tax rate. But at that time, the board had said that if we have the opportunity to call some of that back and prepay it, then we need to take advantage of that, and that's what the board approved last Thursday. And so what we end up with there is the yellow bars after what they approved last Thursday, and we're basically paying off 3.5 years of debt in advance. And what you can see with the bold black bars there are 3-year operational referendums. And you can see that going into 23-24, which would be the first year of our next operational referendum, we only have about less than $500,000 in outstanding debt left to pay that year. So again, that frees up some possible tax funding for an operational referendum, but then also for any referenda that might come out of the work of this group in the next couple of years to take that, where we have to take out debt for any capital projects that might be approved. So with that, I think the next thing to talk about is what's changed in the last year in education, and Nick's going to take that.
Thank you. And just a quick reminder, I'm Nick Kentz with PRA, and I'm sure you guys haven't spent the last 14 months thinking about your planning team so much as other things on your mind. So just a quick reintroduction. I'm going to start off this topic, what has changed in education, just by reflecting a little bit on the facilities, which is obviously where we live, our worlds. And Devin Cack, who will be up here in a minute, and I spent a little bit of time kind of thinking about, from a facilities standpoint, what has changed, or what have we been doing over the last year. And the best thing we could come up with to summarize this, what has changed, is everything and nothing at the same time has changed when we think about our buildings. So over the past year, how we interacted with our spaces, how our kids, how our staffs, how our communities functioned within these facilities was completely disrupted. Almost everything that we took for granted a year ago was changed. And that caused us, who live in the world of planning and thinking about how to organize these spaces, to really reflect on what has been working and maybe what has not been working. Which kind of leads us to the second part of that. What has changed? Nothing. So what does that really mean? When you think about it, over the last year, we've had lots of conversations around adequate square footage. You know, how do we space out like this? Do we have spaces that allow us to spread out in unique circumstances, such as a global pandemic? We've been thinking about what does synchronous and asynchronous learning mean? And in the short term, that was what had to happen to deal with an immediate problem. But as we've thought about for years, as we've thought about what school facilities should facilitate and what they should support, this notion of asynchronous learning, or receiving content, students receiving content through means other than direct instruction, has been part of our planning process. Not that we replace, and we've talked about this over a year ago when we talked about what modern learning is, not that it replaces by any means the classroom, but how do we make the learning spaces more multifunctional? So we all got to kind of live through a forced experiment of injecting more technology into our lives. And I think we learned a lot. A lot was not maybe great, but I think there are some good things that we can also use as we think forward about how these buildings might be organized for the decades to come. So I think we learned a lot about that. And then the last two pieces on here, flexibility and adaptability. When we did our session on educational space adequacy and we were talking about what modern flexible learning spaces are, we used that word a lot, right? Flexibility. We talked about adaptability. And I may have even said, nobody in this room can predict what's coming 10 years from now. Little did we know what was coming 1 year from now. And while we hope we never have to make our buildings adapt to something like we have all been going through again, it is an example of the kinds of change that we know will come, but we don't know what that change really will be. So as we think about how we transform these spaces, how we create new spaces for the future, we want to make sure we keep that flexibility and adaptability at the front of our thinking process. Because the last year has really proven we really can't predict what is coming down the road. And we want to make sure our buildings and our facilities are able to allow the students, the staff, and the community to pivot quickly and adapt and deliver these services and these great teaching and learning opportunities as quickly as possible. So that's just a brief reflection on some of the conversations and things we've been thinking about as it relates to the buildings themselves. But of course, there's lots that's changed in the educational delivery too. And I think Dr. Abbott's going to talk about that.
Well, one of the things that we've been fond of talking about over the course of the last 14 months is with disruption comes opportunity. And I think part of what Nick set up well for me is to talk just for a few minutes this evening about what that has looked like regarding change here in Fort Atkinson to the educational program or educational system. And honestly, we could talk about this for hours and hours. And so to just shed the light on a few things this evening, one of the things that changed very rapidly was an expedited need for our technology implementation timeline. So we knew at some point we wanted to go one-to-one, a device for all of our students. We knew that we wanted our educators to integrate technology additionally and in new ways, in a more meaningful ways in the future with instruction. One of the opportunities through COVID is as painful as it may have been for some in some situations, but these timelines have been advanced very rapidly. We moved to a one-to-one system within a month, and we have continued to implement new hardware and infrastructure systems. And then the instructional tools engaged through technology continue to evolve and change. And perhaps someday, if and when COVID is well in the rearview mirror, or certainly managed differently than it has been able to this extent, instruction will never look the same. These are expectations now of our customers and the learning styles of our students. Is how is it that we don't use technology as a replacement, but how is it we use it as an augment of how it is that we know students would learn best in the future? Virtual learning options, clearly something that we know we've needed to invest in, and we've had many of our students, in some cases all of our students, in virtual learning situations over the course of the last year. But we also know that there will need to be some virtual options for students moving forward. So whether or not that's next fall, test. Would you like me to pause or go? So whether or not, sorry, let me just catch my breath there. All right, so whether or not virtual learning options would be in place for next fall, that is something that we know our customers, something that our students, and frankly, some of our staff may be interested in moving forward. What are those virtual options, and how is it that we can continue to pivot, and how is it that we're able to continue to change as those needs changed? So we went from sort of, if you want to look at traditional, very a sense of rapid change over the last few months, and somewhere in the middle is where we would love to land and then continue to build moving forward from there. And then this sense of academic recovery, which those who know me knows that I don't really care for the term, but I do think that it captures. We've always had students who are in very different places in their learning, with very different needs, with very different service requirements. That has been exacerbated greatly through COVID. Any sense of equity between our learners and families has been greatly diminished during this time, even with our best laid efforts. So what is it that we need for student supports? What is it we need for student needs? And then also, what is it that we need for family supports and needs? What is it that we have to do to have students and families ready to learn? Because if they're not ready to learn, we can have the best facilities possible and the best math program possible. It doesn't mean that it's going to get us where it is that we need to go. And then additional summer or alternative scheduling options. One of the things that we have coming up this summer are some additional offerings that will hopefully address some of the things that I've been talking about. But moving forward, I think there will be an expectation from our community that we have offerings outside of a traditional school day. If we have facilities, if we have the potential for teachers or staff and students and families available for options, how is it that we can use the clock differently to accommodate the facilities that we have? And I think COVID has really ripped that open a little bit for us, and perhaps that's a door that we can walk through a little bit more rapidly than we would have been able to in the past. And then Nick touched on it, but I think there's going to be a continued expectation of versatility and flexibility in the school district. So I think our community knows that we can change quite rapidly. We can adapt quite rapidly and quite effectively, and we can meet needs differently. I don't see that expectation going away anytime soon. And if anything, that sort of nimbleness is really exciting and dynamic, especially for those who feel that change in education hasn't come fast enough. And then finally, I think most in the community, I hope, know that we're in the midst of a new strategic planning process. And this new strategic plan will be in place as we launch the new school year. But the effort of the board, the effort of my administration is to move to a results-driven, very publicly known results-driven strategic plan. What is it that we want our kids to know? How well are they knowing it, and how well are they able to demonstrate it and apply it outside of school? That is very much where we are headed. So the board has accepted some new guiding principles and new beliefs, and over the next month or two, we'll be creating our new vision and then creating our new mission. We'll be setting some rather lofty, rigorous, yet attainable, I suppose, goals over the course of the summer that will frame our new strategic plan heading into the new school year. This isn't coincidental. These elements are tied together on the calendar very purposefully. So how is it that we can use and leverage the work of this group to do what it is that I've just been talking about for the last couple of minutes? Shifting gears a little bit, one of the things that we talked about with this group, many, many months ago was the enrollment of the district. How many kids do we have learning in our classrooms, whether it be virtual or in person, I suppose? And we shared with this group that enrollment was known to be on a downward trajectory for a period of time. We also shared at that point that it isn't a Fort Atkinson issue, it's a regional, if not broader issue for many, many districts who are not seeing rapid growth due to an urban location or a closely related suburban location. So we knew that our enrollment was going down. And whether that's been exacerbated by COVID, we also know in Fort Atkinson we have issues of having sufficient housing and the like. One of the things that I would point out in here, I believe it's the blue was the projection. So that is what we had been forecasting as an enrollment. You'll notice then in the red, that is the current or updated projection. So if you look in the middle on 2021, our September nose count was 2,553 kids. When we shared this information last year, that was the projected enrollment of students in 2024. So that was expressed ahead, so 3 years into what we saw as a reality this year. Clearly, again, some of that could be COVID related. We do have families that have chosen different options that clearly we're working and have every attempt in bringing those families back into the fold. We have, like all districts, some families that have relocated students for the interim in order to accommodate their family needs, and that list goes on. So we're really feeling like next year will be a telling year for us when we start really looking at what is a more solid enrollment projection moving forward. So we felt like we had a pretty good handle on where things were until COVID. And again, this has really changed the game a little bit for us as well. So we still have a great sense generally of where we'll be, but if there is that stabilization that we're all hoping for, I think that will become more apparent and sort of more bankable for us next year. Enrollment, again, as we knew, was something that we were going to need to grapple with moving forward, like most school districts, but it has been stepped up in the last 14 months. So with that, I think I will turn things back over to Devin.
Thank you, Rob. Again, brief intro. Devin Cack with PRA. It's good to see you all again and be here. Now we're stepping into the phase of our meeting where we start to discuss what has not changed. So one being our objective as a group here tonight, and what our charge is, our options, and then everybody loves homework, so there's always homework, a lot of educators in the room. So our objective remains. As FAC members, you've all been charged with identifying a long-range master plan for the buildings of the school district of Fort Atkinson. And as Rob had mentioned earlier, this is something that's likely executable over decades and not something that's just taken on in one foul swoop. So the FAC will identify viable facility solutions to present to the community for feedback, which will be narrowed through community engagement sessions with the final options, I think that's a key word, options, being tested via community-wide survey. So our objective is to provide the school board with an option or options that then they can look at and evaluate through certain means. Where we left off, so as been mentioned a couple times, 14 months ago, it really doesn't feel like all that long, but during that slog, it definitely felt like time was not gonna pass. So it's great to be back here. And we left off that evening in Purdy in February, meeting 6. We had actually just gone through this options evaluation matrix together. And this allowed us to narrow down a multitude of options to 3 that kind of rose. And to identify and properly evaluate those, they were based off of a prioritization of needs, which we as a group had identified in our FAC meeting 5. During that meeting, we identified and what the main categories are, district-wide maintenance, right? We didn't want any rush orders. We wanted to be prepared in advance. Safety and security, we can all understand those improvements. Improving learning environments. So the points at which Nick was sharing with each of you a little bit earlier, making sure that we support today and tomorrow's learning functions. This also included acoustics and indoor air quality, which Jason has also touched on. The next one was equitable access across the district. Specifically, special ed was pointed out during that 5th meeting that we all attended. And then sustainability. So we want to make sure that we can properly accommodate enrollment sustainably, but also identify a solution that's economically feasible and responsible for the district and the community. Nick's going to join me up here, and we're going to run back through our options to get everybody back up to speed. So everybody's got handouts of this.
Yes, they do. Okay, so Devin just showed you that matrix that we looked at last time we were all together, and the 3 that we narrowed down. And we wanted to walk you through these because, little hint, your homework assignment, if you had read ahead, is going to involve reflecting on these options. And when we get together again in May, we're going to have a a much more robust discussion where we consider these three where we left off, what makes sense given what's transpired over the last year plus, and maybe what we need to tweak. So and as Devin pointed out in our charge, we don't necessarily need to drill this down to one. If we get there, that's great. But that's not necessarily the end all of this committee. So we may come out of this and say, there are two options that make some sense, and we'll take those forward. So keep that in mind. So to go back to where we left off, option 3 was one of those 3 options that we had discussed and kind of rose to the top. And to refresh everybody's memory, what this option did was really look at this site that we're at today, Luther, and say, we remove this building that we are in, we construct a new 6th through 8th grade, middle school building on this site. So this becomes our middle school. We leave the current middle school site. What becomes of that building, that site, that's something that would have to be determined in the future. But from a school planning standpoint, we move middle school to this building. At the elementary schools, we consolidate to 3. So we currently have our 4 elementaries, we would go to 3. And those elementary schools would involve projects, including tackling the maintenance list that we've talked about, which is already being done at the high school, but also creating some expanded areas at both Berry and Rockwell, because those are our 2 smaller elementary schools, to allow for renovated spaces within all 3 of the buildings, but Berry and Rockwell would need a little bit more space to inject that flexibility and that adaptability that we talked about. So again, these are long-range plans, and the cost estimates that our partners at C.G. Schmidt had developed for the entire package to tackle the maintenance, the modernization, the replacement of these buildings, all in, was at that time about 108 to 112 million for everything in this option. Something that we need to think about going forward, I believe, is how each one of these options, or options that we develop as we continue this conversation, may be phased over time. So if we look at that total price tag and say maybe the community wouldn't be supportive of $112 million all at one shot, how could we break these things down into phased approaches that could be implemented over those many years and potentially multiple decades to achieve this? So this one, if we think about that a little bit, could work from a phasing standpoint fairly well if we moved potentially the elementary to 3 sites from the current 4 and built the middle school here. So you could potentially think about building the middle school first, doing some preliminary maintenance projects and security projects at the elementary schools, and then potentially a second phase might come back for larger projects at those elementary schools. That's one way that we might be able to think about how we could break the scale of this one down if we need to. Okay?
And for option 7, here's where we would stay with 4 elementary schools, and we would construct a new 6-8 middle school. So as Nick mentioned previous, the schools would be expanded to support collaborative and flexible learning, just like we've talked about before. It would include all the maintenance needs. It would also include the secure entry sequences at each of the buildings. We know, again, that maintenance is occurring, which is great, at the high school. It would also address the secure entry sequence at the high school so that that equity piece is strewn across, as well as the safety and security. And again, you can look at this and begin to think of perhaps how can this large dollar amount be broken up into multiple phases, with potentially a middle school occurring first, and then potentially coming back and addressing the elementary school needs.
Okay. And the last option that we had narrowed down to was option 8. This one was probably the most different of the options that we were considering. If you recall, this one was considering actually shifting to a 4K through 8 model, and actually consolidating, with the exception of the high school, consolidating the district down to 2 buildings, 2 4K8 buildings. So that would potentially take Berry, Purdy, and Rockwell offline and consolidate down to this site, the Luther site, and potentially a site we had said at that time somewhere near the high school. These sites could be, we could think about where those sites would be, but conceptually, in this option, we would fundamentally look at how grade levels are organized across the district. So we talked a little bit about some of the benefits of potentially of having everybody from age 4 through 8th grade under one roof, as well as some of the challenges with this. This is really a big change for the district, even to implement, to build these things. So I think if we think about the 3 that we looked at previously and narrowed down to, from a phasing standpoint, this one might be the most challenging. One, just because of the scale of construction that would really need to happen probably in kind of one single phase, but also just thinking about the logistics of how do we remove buildings and construct new while keeping a fully functional district going. Nothing's impossible. This one just might have some more challenges as we think about how we might phase it. So those were the 3 options and where we left it 14 months ago. So again, Devin's going to talk a little bit more about where we go from here. But again, we want to really reflect on where we were and think about what has transpired and how each one of these options may fit within the realities of the community as we know it now, today in 2021, but also the community as we think we will have going forward into the future, and try to find the best fit for an option or options that we can, I think we just lost our mic, that we can take forward to the board and the community. So I will turn it back to Devin to give you your assignments.
Test, test, test. Go. So your homework, everybody has your agenda. It's conveniently up here on the screen, but you've got it there to take home with you. Your homework is to take those 3 options and try to pick up where we left off, thinking about what has changed and what has not changed. So within those 3 options, at our next meeting, we'll have in-depth kind of discussion on those, and we'd like each of you to evaluate them with respect to the charge of the FAC, what we have all experienced over the last year, and what makes the most sense long-term for the community. It'd be great if you could record your thoughts, both positive and negative, for each option, and come with them and be willing to share your thoughts to the whole group at our next meeting in May. With that, I'll turn it over to Jason. And
I'll just mention one last thing here. I'll be sending out an email shortly after this meeting with a Google form. We're not going to do question and answer in this format, but on that Google form, feel free to share any questions that you might have, any feedback you might have about what you saw tonight. And those watching at home or watching this later can do the same. And then we'll see if any themes emerge from that we'll address at the next meeting, at the beginning of the next meeting, and then we'll go into the homework that Devin shared and start talking about these 3 options in more depth. So keep an eye out for that. I'll shoot it out here shortly after the meeting. And I think that's about it. Thanks for coming tonight, everybody.
Thank you. We got done early. That's a good thing.
Hey.